Good morning. Can everybody hear me out there? Excellent. So I'm here to try to provide just a little bit of historical perspective. And you'll notice that the Forest and Fish Agreement is not the Forest, Fish, and Amphibian Agreement. Despite the fact that this study, the Type N hard rock study, is the most ambitious and longest running study that CEMER has ever conducted. And what I thought I would do today is try to give you a little bit of background on how we arrived at this point in time. The scientists will tell you about the point in time when they first studied or first went out for the first field study, which was in 2006. In reality, the genesis of the study, the seed of this study, was sown in 1998, just as policymakers were discussing the Forest and Fish Agreement in earnest. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this. I'll provide a little bit of context about the history of TFW, and then dig a little bit deeper into how we got to this, this point in time. So first of all, most of the information about the history of TFW or the Forest Practice Board before TFW was started came from this website. And I'm sure I'm going to get some of the facts wrong, but I think I got the story just about right. So there are four important dates that I'm going to talk to you about. One was the first Forest Practice Act that was passed in 1946. The second was the formal Forest Practice Act that really is the thing that you're probably most familiar with. It started or initiated the Forest Practice Board. The third benchmark in time was the Timber Fish and Wildlife Agreement in 1987, and of course the Forest and Fish Law or Forest and Fish Agreement that was passed in somewhere around 2000, somewhere between 1999 and 2001, depending on your point of view. So, as early as 1946, there was concern at the state level, mostly generated from concern at the federal level that our forests were not being regenerated, that there was no consistent effort to replant forests once we harvested them. So in 1946, the state legislature passed the Forest Practice Act of 1946, and really the entire intent of that was to simply make a statement about the necessity of replanting our forests. Again, it was based on this idea that forests were being harvested at an increasing rate, and we weren't paying enough attention to regeneration of those forests. The 1974 Practice Act, as I suggested, was the one that really set the stage for forest practice rule development. This was the one that established the Forest Practice Board, which is administered by the DNR. It developed and promulgated rules. It was given authority to develop guidelines, and it regulated growing, harvesting, and processing of timber. It also, for the first time, really thought about including application and notification procedures that would affect non-timber, specifically non-directly timber-related activities like road construction and maintenance, forest chemicals enforcement, and the relationship to other lands. The forest practices through 1974 through 1987 were really an era of dramatic change. If you remember, it was during this time period that the Bolt decision was redecided in federal court that upheld treaty rights to the First Nation peoples, that they would receive 50% of the harvestable surplus of salmon. At the same time, forest practices and the role that forest practices plays in the maintenance of salmon populations was coming under scrutiny. So in 1979, there was a Class 4 special permit. For those of you who don't know what that means, it means that is those forest practices that had the effect to significantly affect the environment in negative ways, and called into consultation groups of experts that could weigh in on the issues for Class 4 special permits. In 1981, threatened and endangered federal species were first considered, and in 1984 and 85, there were two critical studies that the Forest Practice Board had initiated: the cumulative effect study by a fellow by the name of Raleigh Geppert, and the riparian habitat study by a person by the name of Sackett, and I've forgotten his name. These studies were funded by the Forest Practice Board to give them some context for the development of the rules that were coming. They realized that this was an era of dramatic change, and they needed to be better equipped to deal with that. During that time period between 1974 and 1987, there was turmoil throughout the forest practices. This is the time of period when many lawsuits were filed on forest practices. And forest practices became a contentious, incredibly contentious process. On the heels of the Bolt decision, on the heels of T&E protection, on the heels of many people raising their voice and concerns for environmental protection, lawsuits were filed, and the Forest Practice Board realized that they were getting nowhere. Very little consensus decision-making was done, and in 1987, under the leadership of Billy Frank and several others, Stu Bledsoe, that led the Washington Forest Protection Association, it was decided they would try to seek out a new way of doing business. So Billy Frank, a huge player, of course, in the Bolt decision, proposed a new way of doing business, met with Stu Bledsoe, and they agreed that they would push this agenda. This agenda, of course, resulted in the Forest and Fish, or the TFW Agreement. Now, the TFW Agreement, for those of you who don't know, of course, its main claim to fame is that decisions would be made by policymakers in forest and fish by consensus. Not by majority, but by consensus. That's a pretty high standard. We would then consider the four following topics under TFW: protecting fish and wildlife, water quality and quantity, archaeological and cultural resources, and economic viability of the timber industry. All those values were ranked as important. There wasn't a categorization or a system that suggested one was more important than the other. That was to be decided in consensus-based discussion. The other huge thing that happened during that time period was that CEMR was created. CEMR, which is the Cooperative Monitoring, Evaluation, and Research Committee, was the process that was going to resolve the uncertainty and the difficulties that were generated by consensus-based decision-making. In other words, folks were not going to buy into consensus-based decision-making with such great uncertainty that they couldn't address it through some sort of program that would allow them to collect better information. Stu Bledsoe of WFPA is quoted as saying, "We'll go where the truth leads us." And this is a watershed moment in the development of our forest practice rules. The idea was to share common understanding based on those four values and do good science that would inform important issues. It also generated the first programmatic funding for CEMR. And that programmatic funding came through the state legislature, and it was in the neighborhood of around $600,000 or so a year. This was the first manifestation of the organization of CEMR. We had the Forest Practice Board and Administration Committee, and basically four subcommittees under that. CEMR on the left had some scientific advisory groups. There was an implementation, training information, and data that would do long-term storage of the data. When I went looking to prepare for this talk, I found this slide that was posted by Sarah Cook. And what was interesting about this slide was it was my slide that Sarah Cook used in one of her presentations that I had prepared in about 2002, just as CEMR took off from the Forest and Fish Agreement. Apparently I hadn't, I guess I hadn't patented it. I don't know now if it's true or not, but that's what I found in Sarah Cook. Basically what it says was that there was a lot of literature review, and most of the studies early in TFW were related to physical processes. So in 2001, this is the last benchmark I wanted to talk about, there was talk about, of course, there was lots of pressure on this idea that fish would soon be listed, salmon would soon be listed under the Endangered Species Act. We already had owls listed. There was worry about the Clean Water Act assurances and so forth. And Forest and Fish, a group of people came together, very much like they did in 1987 under the leadership of Billy Frank, and said, you know what, we need to be systematic about this. We need to do a better job of trying to figure out how we're going to adapt to a very dynamic and changing system. So the idea of it under Forest and Fish was that we would achieve ESA assurances or take permits for all fish and certain riparian-dependent species. The reason that's in italics is because that's a part of the story that I want to delve into slightly. It also retained the values of the original TFW agreement, and that was to maintain an economically viable timber industry. It was to provide not just recovery of fish species, but harvestable surplus of salmon species, and it would provide Clean Water Act assurances. And then it would also maintain and restore riparian ecosystems. So here's the digression. This is the part I want to try to tie together with why we're here today. So in about 1998, as this policy body, the TFW policy body, was meeting and deciding how they were going to do this, they had the feds in the room and, of course, all the players in TFW. And they were talking about trying to meet federal assurances for Clean Water Act and T&E species. And at the time, they were addressing sort of the big scope of the Forest and Fish Agreement. And they came to SEMR and said, listen, we're thinking about coming up with a riparian management strategy, and we want to know from you what else we should be considering besides salmon and clean water. They said, what else? So an ad hoc group that consisted of the original TFW Wildlife Committee, along with some other people, including federal biologists who are now engaged in this, joined together and decided that they would try to answer the what else question. So we met. I don't know if some of the old timers are still in the room, but I was one of the members of these committees. You may remember, I guess Jim McCracken was there, Neil Wilkins was there, Brian Bogacek. Anybody in the room a member of this committee? Okay, well, that's what I get for being old. At any rate, we met for 18 months, and we did a fairly sophisticated, what we thought was a fairly sophisticated literature review, where we asked the questions, can we figure out which species, non-fish related, were absolute obligates in riparian or aquatic systems? So for 18 months, we went through lists of hundreds of species, did literature reviews on hundreds of species, trying to figure out which species were really closely tied to riparian habitat and why, and whether or not they were absolutely obligate. We came up with a report, and I'm sad to say that I can't find the report. I handed it to Mark Hayes when he started in 2001, and he can't seem to find it either. The report was the literature review and synthesis of all this work. Before I go there, let me just say this. So at the time, we were all experimenting with what could be possibly covered under the Forest and Fish Agreement. And the idea was that in the early days of the Endangered Species Act implementation here, there was a hard and fast rule that you had to know a lot about the species before they could be covered under a take permit. And unfortunately, the information about a lot of the riparian obligate species, including the amphibians, was that we didn't know enough to know whether or not they needed coverage. And this was a problem, because if you had not enough information, the federal services were not willing to cover the species, unless you could convince them that the process of covering the species would also generate information that would allow them to better conserve those species. So one of the things that the TFW group had to do was convince the services that we would figure out what these species need through our adaptive management program. So in large measure, the only reason that amphibians are covered under the Forest and Fish Agreement is because we had a record of a successful SEMR program. And on the shoulders of SEMR, we said, we're willing to accept large amounts of uncertainty provided we truly endorse and maybe bolster the money that goes to the SEMR program. Now, I've just characterized about 3 years worth of negotiations in about 6 sentences. Let me tell you that it was a very interesting time, but it was also a very intense time. Like all things in SEMR, when you run things by consensus, there is lots of discussion. So there was lots of discussion. What we were able to do is, on the backs of some of the literature review we did, the willingness of the federal services to accept some uncertainty with the promise of additional research, on the urgency of the situation at hand, we were able to address the amphibian question. And thus we came up with a type N strategy. This type N strategy, I don't know if you know this, we realized that type N streams are very important for downstream functions and processes. But a lot of the type N strategy was based on the idea that we would try to conserve those headwater associated amphibian species. And they brought us these famous terms that probably have haunted many of you in your sleep, like the string of pearls, sensitive sites, side slope seeps, headwalls, swales, pips, sips, ephemeral and seasonal non-fish, type N stream junctions, and amphibians for all. So here we are, some 16 years after we initiated this process, in about 1998, initiated this process, into the discussion of study results on headwater stream amphibians and freshwater processes and headwater streams. Remember, this is what the pre-Forest and Fish organizational structure looked like. This is what it looked like immediately post-Forest and Fish Agreement. We had lines and arrows and policy side and a science side and a person that fit right in the middle that was supposed to intercede between the two. It was extraordinarily complex. I'm happy to say that when I offered this diagram to some other folks, they said they had simplified this. So I'll show you a simplified version in a second. I just wanted to really quickly say, so I went through, the great thing about the Forest and Fish Agreement is that DNR has done a great job of characterizing all the studies that SEMR has ever done. And I went through the studies to try to characterize this in visual form. A lot of the history of TFW, of the Forest Practice Board, can be found on that website that I showed you, and WFPA has done a really good job of trying to characterize that as well. But I wanted to show you some of this because there's some really interesting changes that have occurred. So pre-Forest and Fish Agreement, I called the era of method development. There were 26 studies through the period of 1988 through the year 2000 of methodological studies that would allow us to do comparable studies in different parts of the state. And there were lots of literature reviews. This was trying to figure out what we were all about and what needed work. The era post-Forest and Fish was really largely about the areas that we had this greatest uncertainty. Remember, a Forest and Fish Agreement was based on the idea that we could accept uncertainty. We needed to target our science to those big uncertainty issues. And you'll notice that the last fish, that is the fish that stops just before the headwaters start, and amphibians took center stage. Here's another way of looking at those same data, this time by subject area. And I know you probably can't read that from the back, but I wanted to show you that basically the scope of the subject data changed from about 21 different topic areas pre-Forest and Fish to about 13 or 12 on the bottom. They were much more focused on the risk assessment side, and that is the risk of not knowing potentially high impacts on public resources, which was a great in itself an adaptive approach to adaptive management. This is the new program structure that I was offered by the new administrators of the adaptive management program. In summary, I would say that forest practices have had a long history of continual improvement. You know, sometimes we lose sight of how long it takes. As a former co-chair of CEMER, I'm never surprised at how long it takes to get stuff done. But there has been steady progress. And there has been evolution of our process, which is a really huge testament to the folks in this room. If democracy is the worst form of government except for all other forms, consensus is the worst form of democracy. Or the best, depending on your point of view. CEMER is largely misunderstood by those outside of CEMER, but as the commissioner had suggested, it's largely without peer. In other words, we're relatively unique in the world of adaptive management. I used to do this study where I'd go to Google and I'd type in adaptive management to see how many hits I got, and I had this exponential curve. I started doing this in about 1998, and I was up to like somewhere around 600 million hits. I'm happy to say that you guys have adaptive management that actually has a program underneath it. I don't think that occurs very often elsewhere. And then I wanted to also tell you and show you, you'll hear about the results of when we started our field work, but you should know that 6 years before we started our field work, we started thinking about this issue. Thanks very much.